Hello, everybody. My name is Aaron Killian. I'm here at Mount Vernon for the Guild of Professional Tour Guides of Washington, D.C., and I'm speaking today with Judge Rohulamin Quander. It's nice to speak with Judge Quander, or Mr. Q, as your kids call you,
Mr.
at
Q, yeah.
any time, but we are here in particular today because the judge is also a member of the Guild, and he's got a very specific and important relationship with Mount Vernon. So, Judge Quander, I was wondering if you could tell the Guild membership what your family and lineage relationship is with Mount Vernon and the General George Washington.
Okay, well, thank you for the interview and the time. It's my pleasure to be here to share this information. First of all, I always say to my students and my adults too that we're here to have a good time. So it's entertainment, but it's education. And I had one of my fifth grade students coin a new word, edutainment.
Mm-hmm.
So it's edutainment. Well, the Quander family legacy tied to Mount Vernon goes all the way back to at least the 1750s. I say that because when George Washington came and took inventory of who was here, Suki Bay and others of her family who are the Quander ancestors, they were recorded as here. The family has a sustained legacy in the metropolitan area on the Maryland side, which is across the river, and here in Virginia from the 1670s up to the present. And part of that legacy includes having been in involuntary servitude here at Mount Vernon. And when George Washington's will was fully implemented in 1801, his 1799 will, those Quander ancestors that were here were freed, but they stayed in the area. So the documentation, the presence in terms of tax records, land records, court records, transactions of all types, carried on right here in the Mount Vernon area and on the other side of the river, Charles County and Prince George's County. And as time went on, family obtained land, paid taxes, got involved in court cases as plaintiffs, as defendants, and the effect of that created a situation where the legacy of what the family was involved in, whether it was good, bad, or in between, is documented. So some of the things that were on the adverse or negative side, a court case where Felix Quander, for example, is alleged to have stolen some chickens and to have mistreated an animal. I don't know if he did or not, but it's interesting reading, and it also establishes a legacy and a presence and shows us to be average, normal people, despite the fact that our documented history goes back to the at least 1670s right here in the area. And when we did research into family history and went to Ghana, West Africa, they talked about things as far back as the year 900. Mm-hmm. So it goes back a long, long way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we, since I was 12, I think it was 12, I've been coming here, couldn't drive, family, friends, and relatives would come from out of town. My mother, my father say, take them down to Mount Vernon. Sure. And we get the SS Mount Vernon, which is the boat that came down then. We'd come right down and go stop at the pier and huff and puff struggle to get up this hill. I had several of them say, I wouldn't have come here if I'd known I had to walk up this hill. And I said, I got learned very early. I said, that's why I didn't tell you. So one interesting thing, they made a decision, Mount Vernon Ladies Association made a decision early on that Mount Vernon would not be segregated by entrance because the strong presence of African Americans, West Ford, for example, who is a definite Quander ancestor. He was born here and was born downstate, but he lived here, he died here, and African Americans have run this place from the very beginning and built it. Actually, this was built by enslaved Africans. So they made the decision Mount Vernon would be welcome to all. But growing up, we had a situation where right across the river it was segregated. So when the boat came down here, and we were able to go to Mount Vernon, when it stopped at Marshall Hall, they made it very clear that people of the African descent could not get off. Mm-hmm. And if you didn't know, say you were from New York or somewhere, you were stepped over to get off the boat, there would be someone on the staff of the SS Mount Vernon staff who would tell you and sometimes embarrass you if you were a distance away, you were on the other side of, and there were other people. No colored can go ashore. No Negroes can go ashore. So that's part of the legacy of why we still have some attitudes about coming in this area. Even though Mount Vernon was always open, a lot of African Americans don't realize that it was always open. They still think of the legacy of segregation and separation. And I tried to make it clear as I talked to my groups that that was true of the area, but it wasn't true of Mount Vernon, and try to get them to understand that African Americans have been running this place for a long time. My cousin Jay Quander just left recently. He was the director of food service here. My cousin Gladys Quander Tansel, may she rest in peace. For 35 years, she was the first African American tour guide. She started out in domestic service. They called her in the office one day. They said, Gladys, I forget who the director was, would like to see you. She said, what's going to happen? Am I going to get fired? She said, sit down, I'd like to talk to you. And they said to her they'd been reassessing things and looking at what they wanted to do, and they would like for her to start training to become a interpreter guide here. And so her total service was 35 years.
Wow.
And we have, when we check the records, there are a lot of other Quanders who have served here. I'm writing a book right now, it's not finished. The working title, The Quanders Since 1684, an enduring, the Quander family since 1684, an enduring African American legacy. And in that, there are 2 chapters right here about Mount Vernon. Mary Thompson has looked at them, commented, made some suggested changes, verified a couple of things, clarified a couple of things, told me that I should not put that in, not for scandal reasons, but because they couldn't prove it. So I've relied upon her as a valuable resource. And I've had a working relationship. The exhibit now, Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon. When we started talking about that, I think that was 2013, might have been 14. I'm a consultant on that exhibit. So we wanted to make sure that we told the story of the men and women who were enslaved here, but tell their story from their perspective. So that exhibit focuses on those who were enslaved. The Washingtons are around the periphery of it, and the 19 men and women that are featured are telling their individual story. Nancy Quander being one, Hercules being one, Oni Judge being another. Those are 2 people who were in service who ran away because despite the fact that they were in servitude, any thought that they may have been happy with their lot was refuted by the fact that they left. Hercules' daughter, I think she was 5 when he left, and she never saw him again. But when they asked her a little later, how did she feel about her father running away? And she said she was sad, but at the same time she was happy because he was now free.
Now, one of your ancestors that you keep hearing the name of when you talk about your family's relationship with Mount Vernon Judge was Suki Bay, right?
Suki Bay,
and
yes.
She would have been a field slave, correct? She did not work up here on the plantation farm. So how would her life have differed from that of one of the slaves that worked up here at the plantation itself? And am I correct in that differentiation?
Well, there's a differentiation, yes. Suki Bay and Nancy and Rose also, they worked with cloth. They were spinners. And they were at River Farm. They were at River Farm. And
there were 5 farms
there
here
were
at Mount
5
Vernon,
farms.
correct?
Yeah, Mount Vernon is 5 different places. Mount Vernon is a collective name. But River Farm is the next farm on the river over this way. And they were spinners working with cloth. Now, they may have also been tailors and seamstresses, but in the records, they are referred to as spinners. So this would have accorded Nancy and Rose and Suki Bay an occupation or a talent after they were entitled to leave here in January 1st, 1801, to be able to make a living making cloth and then potentially making clothes. And now we don't know if they're buried here, but in our oral history, we believe they are buried here because there are no records. Yeah.
Now, I'm curious with your work as a tour guide, Judge, when you're bringing groups here to Mount Vernon, student groups, whomever, how does your tour differ from maybe the typical tour that gets given here? Because I know that you're at pains to stress that you don't give an African American history tour, you give an American history tour.
Right.
But that being said, because you have the relationship you do with this location, I would assume that your tour takes a little bit different shape. So how do you structure your tour differently?
Well, since I'm not with the other tour guides, I don't know what they say. But I know that they don't say as much because they don't know as much. They don't have a personal connection. I did have one tour guide. I wouldn't call it a run-in. I'll call it an encounter. When I made some reference, and he just, I don't have time for that. They're not interested. I said, wait a minute. And not to be negative, I go to the Holocaust Museum all the time, and I tell my students about the horror of the Holocaust. And this gentleman happened to have been Jewish. I said to him, I would never tell my tour students, don't bother about the Holocaust, nobody's interested in that. And his attitude and demeanor changed because he understood that this African American Holocaust was a Holocaust nonetheless, not the same, and didn't have the severity of the Jewish Holocaust, but it lasted for hundreds of years. So you're comparing apples with a different type of apple. Okay, so I want my students to understand that what I talk about, and to make it very clear, I am not talking about African American history. I'm talking about American history. Slaves, enslaved Africans built this building as they built the United States Capitol. They built the White House, and right now at the Lincoln Memorial, a recent mural went up, not at the memorial, but in Washington, D.C., dedicated to the sons and grandsons of the enslaved people, and they are the ones, the grandsons and sons, that participated heavily, not solely, in the construction of the Lincoln Memorial. So I want everybody to know that this is all part of the American tapestry. And I've had, regretfully, a couple of people, and they didn't say it to me, but they said it, and it came back to me, that if they'd wanted a Black History tour, they would have asked for one.
I see.
And I say it, when I do my tours, I say it about 5 or 6 times to make it clear that this is American history. You may not have heard it before. You may not have seen it in a book, because it's only more recently that it's getting into the books. Michelle Obama herself, when she was giving what I call her farewell speech, she talked about the enslaved Africans that built the White House. A lot of people never heard that before. They go to the Capitol and say, oh, what a beautiful building. And I say, did you ever think about who built it? And I ask, oh, well, let's see, we had German immigrants, we had Irish immigrants, we had Italian craftsmen. Oh, and there were some American people already here before. I said, all of that is true, but you left out a major component. Well, who? And then the children especially. Did enslaved people have something to do with it? Yes, absolutely. They worked from can't see in the morning to can't see at night, 6 days a week. And they built this structure. This structure was not built all at one time, but they were all involved in every component of building America's fabric, in the sense of buildings and institutions. Even the road coming down here from Washington, D.C., one of the Quander family members, not one, but Quander family members, were involved in clearing that road for what would become the railroad path. We now come down the Mount Vernon Highway, but we were talking about it in the 1840s and 50s. They were involved in the physical clearing of that road to become initially a carriage road, and then eventually later on, they were working in timber. This is all part of clearing it to create what would become the Mount Vernon Highway at an earlier time. So we have been integrally involved in every component of this country. There is nothing that African Americans haven't been involved in, and Mount Vernon is most typically an example of that. George Washington knew that, and when we talk about the American Revolutionary War and then later the Civil War, all of this is comprehensive American history. It's a puzzle, it's a fabric. These things don't exist in isolation. So coming here is important for everyone to understand that George Washington, the father of our country, although yes, he was an enslaver, he did own slaves, he had an attitude that was far ahead of those of his contemporaries like Thomas Jefferson and some of the others that were from his time frame. He tried to get them to free their enslaved people, and they would not. He endeavored and decided to free his upon death. And I give him credit, but I hold him responsible because the greater good would have been to free those people during the time he thought about it, not wait until he no longer needed them. But freedom nonetheless.
I'm curious too, Judge, with your history. You're born and bred D.C. You've been in this area all your life. Your family is deeply rooted in this area. So whenever you drive around town, whenever you're moving around suburban Maryland, suburban Virginia, you see shadows and vestiges of where your family has been and how its story is connected with this place. But when you come back here to Mount Vernon, this kind of goes back to the origins of your family. So when you come here, does it hit you in a different way than if you're driving around town and you think, oh, well, there's the church that I went to as a child, or that's where I know my grandfather father spent time there. Is it a different feeling, a different impact for you when you come here?
For me personally, yes, it is a different impact. I want you to understand, though, the family's ancestral history is on the other side of the river.
It's on the
Maryland side of the river. My ancestry is on the Maryland side of the river. There are 4 branches of the Quander family. And there are those who are descended here in Mount Vernon. Their Quander side came from the Maryland side of the river. So my blood is not this blood here. My blood is the Quander blood, but because I started the Quander Historical and Educational Society, we are a structured organization since the 1980s. All of this information has come out because we are all Quanders. Only some of us are descended because they were enslaved here, and free Quander man, Charles, married one of the enslaved, and they had children. Thus, the name Quander was introduced here shortly after 1800 and has been Quander Road and Quander Street are over here. Quander Promise is over there, and Quander Street is in Washington, D.C. They're 4. They have a shared history, but in a common shared history of the ancestry of the Quander family, going back to Ghana.
So the judge and I right now, we're at the Slave Memorial here at Mount Vernon. It's in the same vicinity and on top of the slave burial ground. It's estimated that in excess of 150 grave sites for slaves, people that were held in bondage here at Mount Vernon on this ground where we stand now. And also, your family's oral tradition would indicate that perhaps 3 of your ancestors buried in this area as well. Is that correct?
Well, you said 3, but the oral history says perhaps 5.
Oh, really? Okay.
But at any rate, yes. There are no records of who's buried here. We know Billy Lee, I believe it is the only one. Franklin and Billy Lee were both, they were brothers and in service to George Washington. But Billy Lee is buried here. There's a reference to that. But the records, if there were ever any records or there were none, we don't know who is here. But in our oral history, we do have candidates. Of course, Nancy Quander is one of them. And what we do every year, we come down last Saturday in September, first Saturday in October. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association, in conjunction with the Black Women United for Action, every year they come here for a tribute program. And you do not have to be a descendant or have any connection with Mount Vernon other than historically interested. So we have choirs that come from colleges, universities, high schools. We have people from the general community. We have sometimes we have elected leaders come, and we have a program I've spoken several times through the years. And this is, I forget what number, but we're around 28th annual in that neighborhood. And Senator Sarbanes, Governor Wilder, etc., when they were in office, have come here. And I have delivered the occasion speech. I have spoken here when they unveiled, they didn't unveil it, but placed the wreath on the tomb center right here on the marker. So it is important for people to understand that George Washington was buried just a few feet from here, and Lady Washington, that they are not the only ones. It's so important, and I've said this repeatedly, that George Washington's ability to be great was largely based upon his knowing that he had loyal people, human beings, back here at Mount Vernon who got the crops in, got the crops out, did the fishing, prepared the fishing, fish for sale, ran the distillery, did whatever was needed to be done, prepared the corn to go to market. All of these are necessary components of what it took so that the father of our country could go off to Trenton, Monmouth, and every other place that he had to go to get to the point where Cornwallis had to surrender in 1781. It was a hard-fought battle. The outcome was uncertain, but part of it is to understand that the fathers and the mothers of our nation are on the turf where we stand. That is why this ground is so very sacred, and that is why since about 1983, when the memorial was here, we have come here and have structured annual programs since about 1990. Right behind you is the marker that was put to the, quote, colored servants in 1929, but it was realized in the early 80s this area was overgrown, there was no program, that was not enough. We needed to come and have an upright. And the upright is this marker memorial you see here. This whole area now is uncovered. Students from Howard University in a contest And Harry Robinson, who was my buddy, we grew up together. He was the dean of Howard University School of Architecture at the time, and now retired as vice president of Howard University. So it was people like that that brought it to the fore. Dr. Lillian Abney, who came down here, she's teaching at one of the colleges, I don't want to say the wrong one, in Northern Virginia, and came down here with some students as a project in February, looking for the marker. And they found it back in here. Didn't look anything like that now because it was all overgrown. And she initiated it. And of course, then Judy Burton and some of the others who were descendants took it forward because they had the gravitas for people to say these are descendants who are agitating, even though Dr. Anthony is the one who began to pull back some of the cover, literally the ground cover. So we give those people the credit. Now, my stepping in is because the Quander family's history is so intertwined in this area on the Maryland and the Virginia side, so intertwined with George Washington, so intertwined with the institution of enslavement, but the first documented freedom for the Quander ancestors was 1686, under the will of 1684. Virtually no African Americans have a legacy, very few, of freedom to go back that far. So when we have something like this slave burial site, and we as Quanders, we have a responsibility to share it, to bring it out, to let people know it's not about the Quander family at all. Some people don't understand that. They think, oh, they're Quanders. They think they're somebody special. We are special, but it's a case of what are you doing and what have you done lately. So it's our responsibility. I don't look at it as a burden. It's our responsibility to stand up and stand out, but lift as we climb for the benefit of others.
It's interesting because we were having a conversation earlier off camera about the fact that your family is in a unique position because there's so many African American families that have no documentation of their lineage, right? It's just not something that is available to them because of what history was.
Yes.
But your family is in a unique position, and so that your family feels that responsibility, and it's not necessarily about making your family and aggrandizing them. It's about sort of keeping African American history alive and letting people know that there's an identity there that often gets lost in the shuffle.
Absolutely, and that's why we created the Quander Historical and Educational Society, to share techniques, availability, encouragement, to get people to understand it's not what we have done, it's what you can do. Everybody can do something. You may not have a documented history going back to the 1600s here and tracing back to the 900s in Africa, Ghana particularly. But you can do something, and it's important for you to do something because you can pass it on to your children, grandchildren. You may be 16 now, but you'll be grandma someday. So if you capture an interest and document and preserve, then maybe if you don't research in the records, maybe with a little bit of information you do give from the family Bible or wherever it came from, a daughter, granddaughter, son will pick it up and carry it forward to document and expand the legacy of the family. When we talk about white families, for example, we came over on the Mayflower, or our ancestors came over on the Ark and the Dove. That's good. Ours came over in the belly, chained. That's not good, but it's good too because they are the ones who survived. The weak, physically weak, they weren't morally or mentally weak, they perished. But the stock that came here, they were the strong. And with the strength of that, we built this country. Not just Mount Vernon. I think I mentioned Capitol, White House, Octagon.
Sure.
All of these structures were involved with slave labor. And that is allowing, or did allow, those who were their enslavers to get rich because they got all the money and kept it. And we got nothing.
I'm curious, with and this ground here, I know as a tour guide, when you're bringing groups down here to Mount Vernon, after you see the General's grave, if you have the opportunity to, and you should take the opportunity to, bringing a group down here, this is one of those spots in Mount Vernon where you really have an opportunity to kind of talk with your group about the complexity of the history here, right?
That's
so
true.
if you were talking to a group of guides and you were passing along some wisdom about what's one good story or one good anecdote. If you've got them here and you get a captive audience, you're really on ground where you can communicate a really strong and salient point to them. What's one thing, or maybe two things, that you would sort of put a premium on while you're here? What do you really want to hit home when you stand on this spot, you think?
I think what I do, I've done it before, and I mentioned it just now, I'll go back into it, for them to understand that the fathers and mothers of our country became the historical people that they're recognized as such, because they had enslaved people, of those who did, back on the plantation doing the grunt work so that they could go off to nation build, go off to be president, go off to be first lady, go off to do great things. The portrait of Dolly Madison throwing the picture of George Washington, Stewart's painting, or was it Peale, one or the other, throwing it out the window to a person. Well, guess what? Paul Jennings, the person, 14 years old, told the story, and he said it wasn't that way. First of all, she wasn't on the second floor, she was on the first floor. She didn't throw it out, she passed it out. It wasn't in the frame, it was rolled up. She passed it to me, and he wrote his biography because he was an enslaved person at the White House. Those people today are my friends. I know them. So we have to understand that these great people got to be great because they had people behind them who made them so, or freed them up to do, to think, to invent, to write, to communicate, to hold tea and salons with the Marquis de Lafayette, because they didn't have to be out there pushing a plow behind the oxen or feeding the chicken and slapping the hogs. This is all nation building. So the people who died and lived here and died, they too are the fathers and the mothers. They too are the founders of this great nation. I just think that people need to approach history with an open mind and understand that whatever they read in the history books, there's a backstory, a side story, that there's more to it than that. They need to understand that the American fabric and tapestry is an inclusive one. It's not just the people on the top, whether they be white or whatever their racial background is, that there were people behind them. There's the woman behind the man, the enslaved behind the master. All of these make up the American story. And even if you don't know it, you have to have an open mind to realize that there's more than what you just read on the page.
And one last thing, Judge. You want to get in any plugs for the Lives Bound Together exhibit, the new exhibit here at Mount Vernon? You're intimately involved in a consulting role.
Yes.
Pitch it to us. Give us an elevator speech about why, when groups come here, they need to spend some time in Lives Bound Together.
There was a realization that the story of enslavement in America is being told from the perspective of the enslavers. The Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Madisons, etc. Mount Vernon, in taking the lead, said we need to tell a different story. We need to look at the lives of the enslaved from their perspective. So the exhibit, Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon, picked out 19 people, and they are at the core. Each of the 19 has a story that's told through the holograph and through materials and information that they have. And the Washingtons are around the periphery. It's a crime, if you want to call it that, to realize that at the time of death there were 5 Washingtons being supported by 317 enslaved people. So we need to look at the enslaved people and some of their stories. So the 19 that are selected are representative. And of course Nancy Quander is one of those 19, and we're delighted to have that. So I think people need to look at this exhibit from the perspective of the enslaved. That's my message.
Well, Judge, it's been such an honor to talk with you today. Thank you for your time, sir.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.